My name is Chi Man. I'm the host for today's webinar, and I am Senior Counsel of Yingke Law LLP, New York office. I welcome everyone again for today's great webinar, How to Conduct Business in Southeast Asia, Vietnamese Case Study. So under this background of trade war, increased tariffs, retailers are looking to other places other than China for sourcing. What are the benefits of shifting business from China to Vietnam? How to ensure a seamless and successful transit? What to consider before beginning business in a new jurisdiction? Please welcome our head of Southeast Asia practice, Christopher A. Musel, for his insight and presentation. Chris is one of the most experienced US lawyers regarding the corporate and commercial laws of countries in Southeast Asia. Over a 22-year period, Chris has developed an expertise in cross-border M&A, project finance, compliance, real estate, intellectual property, and trade. He has in-country experience in Cambodia, Japan, Vietnam, and Singapore, and has continued to advise clients in all these countries since transferring his international practice to the United States in 2014. Chris has served on several boards of the American Chamber of Commerce. So please welcome Chris for his wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Shiman, for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody. Yes, I'm hoping that those 20 plus years of my focusing on Southeast Asia from a legal perspective principally, but also from a practical perspective when it comes to trying to help our clients will be helpful to you, and the things that we are not able to cover, certainly you can follow up with a question and we'll try to help you in that regard. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to try to present today. It shouldn't be more than 30 minutes in total. I'm going to give a quick overview of Southeast Asia, a little commentary about M&A, and then we'll shift over to Vietnam and look at a couple different issues. Conditional sectors I'll talk about with regard to the so-called hot sectors that I'm going to cover, which are on your screen here. So I won't have to go through that list, but we'll cover all that and then move on to a couple of issues regarding due diligence, approvals, which there's two types of approvals, initial and final approvals. And then we'll talk a bit about general legal issues and some contractual things that you'll want to put into your contracts. And then finally, a comment about how to operate or how to manage your operations in Vietnam if you don't actually have a full-fledged flying flag there. It can be done a little bit remotely, especially now that we're coming out of this pandemic. Everything seems to be remote these days. So let's get started. This is ASEAN. And ASEAN, as many of you may know, is a group of 10 member countries. They're listed here on your screen alphabetically. And Vietnam is kind of right in the middle, upper middle part of the group. And that positions it well, frankly, for the internal ASEAN trade. And we'll talk a little more about that later. Singapore actually is the so-called hub of Southeast Asia and doing business, in Southeast Asia. It's easy access to most of the capitals in the region. Singapore law and Singapore arbitration, known as SIAC, are very popular for agreements that are done with foreign companies into most of ASEAN, but particularly into Vietnam. And I know that most of the Fortune 500 companies, when they establish an office in the region, they often will establish in Singapore first. Just a quick comment about M&A flow. On the right side of the screen, there is a chart shows the M&A for Southeast Asia in 2020. The number of deals roughly around 1,500 deals, at around $52 billion. Now this is Southeast Asia is often likened to Eastern Europe as far as the amount of activity in M&A. And you'll see then the comparative number for Eastern Europe, a few more deals in 2020, 1,900, and the valuation was 30 billion, so a little less than ASEAN. Here's another comparison often made. This is Middle East and North Africa, or the MENA. Again, number of deals roughly around 1,500. And in this case, the valuation in MENA was a little higher. It's 59 billion versus 52 billion. But it just helps to kind of get a sense of the scope of M&A investment in ASEAN. Competitiveness of Southeast Asia, it is considerable. Principally, the highly skilled but low-cost labor is one of the main drivers. But to further sweeten the investment, governments will, including Vietnam, will reduce taxes. In some cases, there will be a tax holiday for up to 6 years. There will be subsidized water and power, leases on the property sites, and reduced tariffs on imported capital goods. You also have available first world infrastructure. So the roads and seaports are excellent in many countries. Vietnam is trying to catch up, and we'll get into that a little bit later. There's an increasing percentage of foreign ownership permitted in many of these countries, and more liberal regulations regarding profit repatriation. So it's each year, pretty much, things are getting better, certainly every decade, for investment in Southeast Asia. Last comment about Southeast Asia is that just recently, in November 2020, they entered along with their 5 major trading partners into the so-called RCEP. This is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is a massive block, trade block. In fact, it's the largest one in the world. 30% of global population is 2.2 billion, and 30% of global GDP at a little over 26 trillion. So that's a significant achievement for ASEAN, and that should bring a lot of additional interest into Vietnam in particular, but all of ASEAN with that kind of powerful trading bloc. So let's shift now over to Vietnam. And typically when I do presentations of Vietnam, I like to show these 2 photos. The photo on the left was a French colonial era post office in downtown Saigon. And the building that you see on the right is what replaced that post office. This is a common pattern that you're seeing not only in Saigon and Vietnam generally, but obviously throughout Southeast Asia, where you're getting very modern buildings coming up to host the companies that are coming in. Luckily, there's lots more French era colonial architecture still in Vietnam that didn't get torn down. And in fact, quite a few in Saigon that are there for the tourists to come and view. Some of them get converted to restaurants, et cetera. So let's look briefly at the history on trade. First of all, in 1975 was the end of what they call in Vietnam the American War. Obviously, they don't call it the Vietnam War. And there was some internal strife within Vietnam for the years following 1975. There was a war within Cambodia in around 1979, 1980. And so things quieted down by the mid-80s, so that the government passed what was called the Doi Moi renewal process. Basically, it was following the Chinese semi-capitalistic trend, which allowed some measure of privatization and capitalizing on investments. And that quickly started a process of growing the GDP for Vietnam. The end of the US trade embargo was in 1994, and then entry into ASEAN as the economy grew in 1995. 2001, important US-Vietnam BTA, bilateral trade agreement, was signed, and I'll show you the effect of that in a minute. Then there was entry into WTO, World Trade Organization, in 2007. 2008, another important trade bloc agreement, the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which got renamed Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, CPTPP, after the US withdrew in 2017. And then I've already mentioned the RCEP, which Vietnam was part of as the bigger group of ASEAN. So all of that is a great trend and should be providing initial incentive for investment in Vietnam. Another chart, a couple of charts just to show you what M&A in Vietnam looks like compared to Southeast Asia. So now the Southeast Asia chart is on the left, and the M&A for Vietnam is on the right here. You can see that roughly a quarter of deals done, 309, almost 400 deals in Vietnam in 2020, a quarter of the total in ASEAN. The valuation is actually in millions, not billions. So that's, I think I'm doing my math correct, that's roughly 3 billion, which is rather low compared to the larger 52 billion in ASEAN. But what that also signals is that getting in on the ground, invested in companies in Vietnam is a fairly low bar. The costs are not as high as other parts of ASEAN. Trade in goods with U.S. Is also useful to see. It shows the development of trade generally, exports generally for Vietnam. So back in 95, 96, there was actually a trade deficit that Vietnam had. So it bought more goods from U.S. than it sold. But that only lasted for 2 years. And ever since 1996, as you can see from the orange bars, trade and exports to U.S. has been growing. 2001, 2005 in particular because of that U.S. BTA I mentioned earlier. And then just generally as the economy grew, more investment coming in each year, we're now upwards of almost 70 billion in exports per year to the U.S. So that's a significant benchmark or milestone. 2019, Vietnam was U.S.'s 13th largest trading partner globally. Also, another useful indicator, I believe, is looking at Fortune 100 companies. Where are they located in ASEAN? And in this slide, you see that a quarter of the Fortune 100 companies that have offices in Singapore were also doing business in Vietnam. So you have a list here. This is, some arguments that this is a bellwether of sorts, right? If you've got major corporates like this coming in, then that gives a certain confidence for smaller investors, knowing that the big players have found the market suitable, it's passed their board of directors, and they're off to the races. Several of these companies have been in 15, 20 years, actually. So they saw the writing on the wall early that Vietnam was a significant and aggressive Asia tiger, and they needed to be in the market. Company numbers also are useful because if you're looking for targets to invest in, obviously you need companies. So this has been a slow but pretty initially slow increase. In 1999, there were only 3,600 registered companies. But as the laws changed, we quickly ramped up. 2001 to 45,000, and then just a general increase over the years, partly due to what I call these interim laws. These are the investment and enterprise laws that changed and made investment more friendly and business registration easier. So now in 2020, we're up to 800,000 registered businesses, and then there's 1.6 million household businesses, which are not licensed in the same way or not registered in the same way. Anyway, all of the companies, certainly the registered companies, what I call over-the-counter OTC, are available for investment, except conditional sectors, which I'll cover in a minute, in which case you'll need a JV partner. There's also listed companies. There are two major exchanges in Hanoi and in Saigon. And traditionally, there was a maximum cap of foreign investment at 49%, but that's now finding a slightly higher figure depending on approvals from the government. And again, conditional companies accepted. So here are the conditional sectors that I've been mentioning. There's 39 of them. I've got them on 2 slides here. I've highlighted in red a couple of the sectors which I believe are in the sort of the hot sector market. So yes, they're conditional, but the country, Vietnam, needs investment in these sectors. And so getting approvals, even though they're conditional, should be pretty easy. I won't bother to go through the whole list, but again, the ones in red we'll cover in a minute. This is another M&A chart that just gives you a sense of the other sectors. I won't cover all of them. I'll be covering real estate, financials, consumer staples, and energy and power. But you can see the number of deals, generally speaking, in the consumer, you're going to get a greater number of companies formed and deals done. So that usually leads to the number of deals, whereas industrials, even though it's not the greatest number of deals, it's usually the highest value. So here are the so-called hot investment sectors that I've wanted to focus on today. So it's logistics and transportation. There's been an almost 50% increase in 2019 of the number of companies operating in this space. Similarly, infrastructure, especially in energy and mining, is up even over 50, so 51% increase of the number of companies created to do infrastructure projects in 2019. Real estate and banking / fintech, and some of that being driven by private equity fund divestment. So let's look at the first one, logistics and transport of goods. That's basically import and distribution by another name. Vietnam has a very young demographic, 70% of the population under the age of 40. So most of the folks in the country were not alive during the conflict years, which we've seen a pattern there that makes them a little bit more entrepreneurial, and that's boded well for Vietnam. Foreign-made FMCGs, again, those are fast-moving consumer goods, are highly sought after, and as disposable incomes in Vietnam rise, these products are generally thought to be of great interest, and there's been a lot of import, including American goods, into Vietnam over the years. January 2009, the WTO entry is really what kicked off a lot of this, and it's been growing ever since. Initially, it was a wholesale distribution outlet, and retail was a little held back. There was this non-tariff barrier issue, which eventually got sort of ironed out. So pretty much import distribution is fairly easy now for Vietnam. Looking at the second sector, we're talking about infrastructure. And this area, it's an area that's of great concern to Vietnam because they need infrastructure spending. They do raise the taxes to try to then allocate funding for infrastructure, but as ADB has pointed out many times, Vietnam simply is not keeping up in many cases with what they say is a 15 to 20% annual expenditure on infrastructure to allow the country to keep its, what was once upon a time, a 7% GDP growth year on year. It's now dropped down to about 4% for 2020, which is still pretty good. But it had been hovering around 6% for like the last 5 years. So anyways, what is, the expression, with crisis comes opportunity. So it is an opportunity for foreign investors to come in and to invest in the infrastructure sector. The following three slides I borrowed from the ADB. This is a little bit more of a macro view of Vietnam. Vietnam is over here on the right. And the road network is an important part of connectivity in the region. So this is what the sort of developed road network looked like in 1992. This is how it's developed up until about 2016, and probably not too much greater presently. And then by 2030, this is what the network should look like. This is most of ASEAN, but you see a lot of connectivity to Vietnam. So with this comes, again, opportunity for investing in port upgrades, toll roads, toll bridges, even some railway, certainly mining and telecom. Opportunities come when you have this kind of physical upgrade in your road infrastructure. Mining, in particular, is an interesting area. There's precious and semi-precious gems, as well as gold and less precious metals. Bauxite, coal, is available and also of great demand. And I note that if you're in the surveying or exploration services business, you can actually advise and get contracts in Vietnam without establishing a legal entity. And finally, this entity called Yingke is the state-owned mining company, and that entity often equitizes or sells off some of its subsidiaries. So there's an opportunity as well for foreign investment. Then we have real estate as our third sort of hot sector. Like the US and other parts of the world, there was a bubble, a real estate bubble. It started to grow in 2001, and 2006, 2007, it began to correct. And so for 2 years, 2007, 2008, there was significant downturn in the real estate market. And sadly, the market really hasn't recovered to the extent that it had before the correction. So there's still great investments available in real estate in Vietnam. Private equity funds often are divesting projects. These are often mixed-use properties, commercial, retail, and/or residential. There's also a fair number of resorts, and I've referenced your China Beach and Hoi An and Nha Trang, all kind of the center part of the country, absolutely fabulous beaches in all cases. Okay, land ownership is a little tricky in Vietnam. Technically, you can't own land. What you end up with is a land lease. So when you're in the process of getting your project approved, you'll get what's called an LUR, a land use right certificate. And those documents are critical to getting projects up and running. And it's all part of the process for investment in Vietnam when you need land. Finally, banks and fintech is another area which is quite interesting and potentially very lucrative for investment. Historically, maximum investment in banks was 30%. And then recently, the intermediary payment services, or what we call IPSs, which is in essence fintech, has been allowed, all indicators will be allowed up to 49% foreign investment. Additionally, government is pretty careful about prudential requirements, so they make sure that the banks are pretty healthy. And finally, as an investor, what you would hope to eventually do, if the bank or the fintech entity is not already listed, you would want to list that company, basically an IPO on either the Hanoi or the Saigon Stock Exchange. The other point, I guess, to make about this would be private equity divestment. There are many closed-end funds that are selling off. They have to do this on a sort of a routine 5 to 7 year window. Sometimes it's 3 to 5 year windows. So there's opportunities from the private equity funds in many sectors, but banking and fintech for sure. And in some cases, they're just looking for additional capital to come in, and so they'll keep control of the investment. In other cases, they will do a wholesale divestment. Okay, shifting now to due diligence, basically just figuring out whether Vietnam is the right market for you. There's plenty of reasonably low-cost ways to start to explore and research Vietnam. There's lots of information on the internet in English, as well as Vietnamese, if you have access through, or facility with Vietnamese language. And it's important to, get a feel for the market. What you don't want to do is something which was done in Japan a couple of decades back, the famous Esso case. Esso, as you may know, is phonetic for SO, Standard Oil. So they wanted to expand into Japan. They put Esso gas stations up around Tokyo, and nobody bought the gas. And it was just a puzzle to the companies, like, why not? In many cases, their gas prices were even lower than the competitors, only to find that Esso in Japanese means lemon or inferior product. It's kind of a slang term. So once the company figured that out, they changed it to Standard Oil, and then everything worked out just fine, and they've been doing booming business in gasoline in Japan since. But you don't want to repeat this kind of issue, right? If in Vietnam, your product, your brand, whatever has a unique connotation or a negative one, you want to see that coming and maybe change the branding. You also want to see whether there's parallel importing, what kind of competitors you have, will your pricing be sufficient, et cetera. So a lot of this stuff could be made available or is available on the internet. The other sources for this kind of information would be home country resources. So in the case of US, we have US Department of Commerce, we have all these export agencies, what we call ECAs, Exim, OPIC, TDA. US Commercial Service, these are offices, they have a Washington base, but their main offices are in each of the embassies overseas. And then the embassies and consulates have a build out beyond that in many cases. So you can contact them with questions and they'll often answer for you. There's also chambers of commerce, which are very useful. Menchie mentioned that I've been active in the American Chamber of Commerce, or AmCham, which is true. I find that very useful, keeping in touch with the pace of investment, and our clients are excellent in sharing information with us. But you have all these other listed chambers of commerce. If you feel comfortable working with them, they're often, you don't have to per se be from, let's say, Canada for the CanCham to be able to help you out. They might be able to facilitate some information or even a partnership meeting. The Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry, VCCI, and the ITPC, at the bottom here, those are two local chambers of commerce, also very good with information, sharing that in English. I have a good English facility there in both of those Vietnamese chambers. If as much research as you do, you find there still looks like a green light, you can hire a marketing firm. There are several available there, including the big one, AC Nielsen, who can then take things kind of the next level as to whether your product would be saleable or your service would be saleable. Obviously, there are legal issues. We'll discuss a few more in a minute, but obviously you would want to hire a firm like ours to give you the legal framework, discuss any potential deal breaker issues, et cetera. And then accountants, you probably need to get an accountant on board eventually. It's sort of a joke, but not entirely, that there are 3 sets of books in Vietnam, the so-called real books, financials, which are basically what the owners use to kind of figure out whether they're making a profit or a loss. Then there's the quote unquote official books, which are what are filed with the government, which historically have been a bit deflated in revenue and profits so that the tax is lower. And then there's the so-called investor books, right? So you might be handed slightly inflated revenue or profit numbers. So the accountant will be able to suss out a little bit of that for your benefit. Initial approvals are important, and you'll want to set up some meetings with the government. Again, offices like ours in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, although we don't have a flag flying per se, we have affiliations there and folks on the ground who will be able to quickly follow up and do meetings on your behalf. And if you get a approval in principle, that's what you're looking to do initially with those meetings, only to then move on to final approval, which is done through a formal application submission. It can take a few months to get those done. You need to be translated into Vietnamese, and that's very doable. Getting a little shorter each couple of years. Quickly, legal issues and practical solutions. First of all, everything you need, everything written in English will need to be translated to Vietnamese so that you have full understanding, especially with your joint venture partners. You'll want to not have a situation where you end up in arbitration and the Vietnamese side says, hey, we didn't understand the English documents, so how can we be held liable? We would not have agreed to the term if we had known. So you have a Vietnamese translation which removes that argument. Choice of law is important. If you're a foreign investor, typically you can get any foreign law that you choose to. Singapore is very popular in in Vietnam, and it's a very solid British-based legal system. And similarly, the dispute resolution, as I mentioned earlier, Singapore arbitration is very popular because rule of law is very strong in Singapore. Limitations of liability, you always want to put those in your agreements, even though there's some issues with enforceability, but just it's getting more the case every year. So you always want to have those provisions in. Intellectual property rights protection, IPR, you want to have those provisions in your agreement, and you typically want to have a standalone separate IP agreement, which gets filed with the national office in Hanoi for your enforcement. Non-compete terms, again, that's a work in progress, not always going to be enforced, but you want to put that in your agreement. Notice provisions are important in Vietnam, because if you don't give your, let's say, subcontractor notice that they breached, they continue to produce goods, they can actually recover the cost of production, even though they have breached. It's a quirky little twist in Vietnamese law. Forex, another issue, foreign exchange and repatriating funds. Want to have that sort of clearly set when that's going to happen. As a general matter, commercial banks occasionally run a little short on Forex, so you want to prepare well in advance for your transfers. Compliance issues, again, a little tricky in Vietnam. The local laws for anti-bribery are actually tougher than the laws in the US. So we have a law called Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA. An example of this is for roughly around $13,000. It's Vietnamese dong 300 million. It's actually a capital crime if you were to give that money to a government official, punishable by life in prison or the death penalty. So you want to be very careful, obviously, about payments to the government. There is something called a facilitation payment, which is permitted under US FCPA. But that also you have to watch, because there is a provision in Vietnam that for just 500,000 dong, which is about $22, that technically anything above that would be a violation of their anti-corruption or anti-bribery laws. It's also an issue of who exactly you're dealing with. So who are government officials, who aren't. Pharmacists, for example, in many cases are considered state officials. And then down here at the bottom, I know that if you're hiring a chemicals expert, a former government official is not allowed to do that testing until after 5 years they've left the government. So in other words, they're still considered part of the government for 5 years. So things like that, you just have to be aware, and that's the kind of thing that your law firm like ours would make sure you knew about. The other, and this is the last point, the other issue that you want to consider is if you get an operation up and running, or you've invested into an entity, but you don't want to set up a fully staffed office, you can do a streamlined office, which is called a rep office. It can't conduct any sales, but you're allowed to monitor activities from a rep office. Another way to do it would be a secondment. You actually just fly somebody in and have them work part-time in the target company. Then another option is just to do routine fly-ins from your regional office or even from the States. And then if you really want to kind of step back, you could just have your lawyers or your accountants do some random spot checking. So it's fairly easy to get folks to work with you on that basis, and a good way to keep an eye on your investment. So that's it. That's a lot said, I realize, in a short amount of time, and no doubt there's questions, which I'd be happy to answer. But thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Chris, for the wonderful presentation. You walked us through both the history and all the industries in Vietnam. This is very informative. Thank you. Now let's move to the panelist section, and please welcome Henry Lee to join our panel. Henry is the co-founder, co-managing partner of Yingke Law and had its China practice. He's also a partner of Beijing Yingke law firm, the largest law firm in China. Henry practices principally in the area of corporate and international law, with emphasis on cross-border mergers and acquisitions, joint venture transactions, international sales and distribution transactions, technology transfers and licensing, cross-jurisdiction dispute resolutions, and entertainment law. Henry has extensive expertise and experience between China and the US. And in 2015, Henry Lee was appointed as a board member of Yingke Global Legal Service Alliance, the first international alliance of independent law firms headquartered in China with 22 members practicing law in 53 countries. So please welcome Henry Lee to join our panel with Chris. And since we have a great panel and based on, Chris has presented a wonderful presentation. So there are several questions I'd like to throw to the panel for discussion. And what types of companies are typically formed in Vietnam for M&A transaction and venture capital deals?
Yeah, there are principally two types of companies that are legal forms that are used, fairly well known to Americans. The first one is a limited liability company. And these, there are two types, a single member LLC and a multi-member LLC, which would have to be two or more, but not more than 50 entities. And the articles that basically govern those legal forms are similar to those that you would find in the US. The other main form is called a joint stock company. In this case, you have to have at least 3 shareholders, and there's an unlimited number of shareholders after that. The charter for that kind of entity is, again, a document that would look fairly similar to the usual articles of incorporation in the US. And there's a standard model which can be modified for investors' purposes. And the JSC, or joint stock company, is particularly useful for listing companies. So if you're investing in a private company now and you want to go to IPO, you want to have a joint stock company. That's the vehicle for listing on either of the exchanges in Vietnam.
Interesting.
Thank you, Chris. I do have a question regarding the company structure as well. We all see a lot of investments. We see that foreign investors, what they do is that they invest, they incorporate a holding structure, a holding company in Singapore or another regional center, and they use their Singapore company to hold their actual operating entities in other Southeast countries. Is that an advisable or useful structure in your view?
That is useful. Keep in mind, though, that when you are asked to submit your licensing documentation, there are requirements as to how long the foreign investor has been in business, in operation. So in other words, if you were planning this year to invest in a company, let's say it's an existing joint stock company in Vietnam, and in anticipation of that, you set up a brand new company in Singapore, you would have to be able to prove that that Singapore entity has some wherewithal, and typically there would be a few years of operation that would be needed. You need financials to show that this has been a viable company. So if your new Singapore company has just been formed, obviously you don't have that background. So what you would have to do instead is look at the next best thing, which would be the parent company's operations, if it's US or China, or wherever it would be. Then those financials and that backstory would have to be delivered in your application. So to answer your question, yes, you can use those intermediary vehicles like in Singapore or Hong Kong, in fact, is another popular venue. But you do have that issue with investment in Vietnam, that you have to substantiate the vehicle that's going to be doing the investment.
So Chris, what issues are there regarding the traditional sourcing of goods from Vietnam for export, like shoes, clothing, furniture, etc.? And have the US-China trade issues affected sourcing in Vietnam?
Yeah, good question. Actually, 2 questions there. So the first one, what issues affecting current sourcing? I alluded to the infrastructure as one of the sectors that's very promising for investment. And in fact, the bottlenecks in infrastructure have caused some issues for companies, big companies, particularly in those areas that you mentioned, like shoes and clothing and furniture, to get the goods from the factories to the port and shipped on time. Huge backups, bottlenecks on the highways and at the bridges, and in some cases the ports. So those are areas where infrastructure is really needed to further expand the exports. And anybody who's registered with us today and maybe from working with one of those companies that sources in Vietnam will know that issue very well. The second part of your question about U.S.-China trade and how that's affected Vietnam, the answer is it has impacted it significantly. And the reason why is that by moving production to Vietnam, of course, manufacturers, Chinese manufacturers have been able to get around the tariff barriers that have been imposed against Chinese exports. Now, this is a matter of public record, so I'm not telling you anything out of school here, obviously. But you have to be able, typically in that scenario, to have a very solid JV partner in Vietnam, preferably producing similar goods to what the Chinese company would otherwise be producing. In some cases, there can be factories built from the ground up in a pretty short amount of time with necessary equipment brought down from China. And those kind of operations also now have happened in the last year or so. But ideally, a joint venture structure is the best way to go for that kind of thing. And it's been done, it's being done until the trade issues get sorted out with the US. I think it'll continue.
Interesting. You also mentioned in the presentation that foreign FMCGs imported into Vietnam have become popular due to higher disposable incomes. But what about investment opportunities in Vietnamese companies making FMCGs for local consumption and export to the US and elsewhere?
Yes. Again, a big market. I think I showed a chart where it showed consumables, the number of companies formed to deal with consumer products, especially FMCGs, increases quite a lot every year. And there comes a point when maybe some of the foreign goods, lose their shine a little bit. So local companies in Vietnam have been producing, world-class now products for the domestic market, but as well as for export. And just off the top of my head, there are at least 5 companies I can think of that I know of that are actively pursuing foreign investment. They're making things like pasta, there's baked goods, there's canned fruit and vegetables, dairy products, let's see, purified water is another one. So these are the kinds of companies, different parts of the country in Vietnam, actively, as we speak, looking for investment. And that's just, a handful, literally. There would no doubt be dozens, if not hundreds, looking for investment. And so that's the kind of thing that makes Vietnam exciting.
Interesting. So is it possible to have the manufacturers in China to move to Vietnam? And how difficult is it?
Yeah, I will take that a little bit. So apparently the answer is yes, definitely it's possible. And Vietnam has been, in fact, more and more popular among the Chinese manufacturing industry. And it has been becoming the most popular country in Southeast Asia region for the Chinese factories to move their manufacturing capacity to. A lot of reasons, right? I mean, the two countries, they have some similar legal system. They share a lot of same culture, same holidays. They all celebrate the same traditional Chinese holidays, Chinese New Year, and mid-moon, all those kind of holidays. And their dining is similar as well, easy for the Chinese employees to adapt in the new country. And it's just the whole thing. And also the local government has been offering a lot of investment incentives, which were available in China from 20 years ago, but no longer exist in China. So all of these factors are attracting Chinese investors to move their factory, or at least to open a new factory in Vietnam as well. So definitely it's possible, and it is happening every day. Although for the Chinese factory owners to open a new factory or move their factory to Vietnam, there's certain relatives need to be handled in China, mainly what they call the ODI approvals, the Overseas Direct Investment Approvals. That including the approval by the Ministry of Commerce and also the national, what they call NDRC, the National Development and Reform Committee. And also a registration with the China Foreign Exchange Administration as well. So I think the short answer is that this is definitely doable, but it takes time. It normally takes the Chinese company somewhere from 3 to 6 months to get all the approvals from China to move their machinery, their people, and also their money to Vietnam to start manufacturing there. We also see from our practice that there has been something what we normally call an on-demand moving. Sometimes the Chinese factory has been discussing the possibility with their American buyers, with their major customer, and their customer has been encouraging the Chinese factory to move their manufacturing capacity, either half a part of that, of the entire of their capacity to another country like Vietnam. And that raises a few issues. For example, if you are discussing that with your Chinese OEM team or your supply chain in China, that something needs to be started earlier. I mean, it's not happening in a month or two. It's not like you were saying, hey, we want you to, because of this high tariffs, because of the trade war, I want you to start manufacturing from Vietnam from next month. It's not possible. You need to give your factory from half a year to a year to complete that transfer. And so something needs to really to be think about like ahead of time. And also a lot of situations like that, the Chinese factory normally require their customer, their buyer to sign a certain contract saying that if I'm making the capital investment to move my factory to Vietnam or to Cambodia just for your contract, they want a guaranteed return. They want a guaranteed volume of purchase or guaranteed orders in the next 5 to 10 years. And because that's something to justify their capital investment return. And if that's the case, is apparently those contracts needs to be carefully drafted and reviewed. You probably need to make certain promises to the Chinese factory in order to encourage them enough to move. But also a lot of considerations need to be taken. For example, if there is some force majeure situation, if there is some special situation like the COVID, and I can no longer afford buying the same amount of products as we promised, then we need to have some way out from the contract as well, because otherwise you will be locked in there and you might be taking a higher responsibility for the capital investment made by the owner of the factory. So that's something to be considered as well.
That's very right. So what do you think are the pros and cons for sourcing products from China or Vietnam?
Yeah, so I think like there are definitely a lot of pros of sourcing your product from China, of doing the OEM or ODM from China. For example, first of all, there are of course more options in China. There are so many factories, so many suppliers in China that you can choose from. There's definitely a buyer market, and you will have a better bargaining power on the pricing, on the lead time, everything when you buy from China. And also another thing is that relatively the production capacity in China is still much higher than other Asian countries. That's why for those major buyers, Walmart or Target or Apple, they are still heavily relying on the supply chain from China, because for the volume they are purchasing, China is the only country has the capacity to supply. And also China has the most complete supply chain in the world. If your product is more like an assembly of a lot of different parts from different suppliers, like cell phone or other consumer digital products, you actually need not only a factory, you need a lot of suppliers. Your factory, your contractor in China needs to make the purchase from all different kind of vendors and to assemble the products. And that's why China is the only place that you can almost buy everything and put them together to make the final product. And also, in China, there are more options to get financing, especially for the factories. The China banking system, insurance system, and the financing system is still rather more advanced than other Asian countries. So if you need some more financing, China probably offers more options. And that's why a lot of Chinese factories are currently able to offer to their American buyers like 0 down payment, 100% upon delivery, all those kind of stuff, because they rely on the financial system to get finance. And also China has the VAT exemption for exporting. That's apparently a 17% discount being offered to foreign buyers. But same thing in Vietnam, there are a lot of tax exemptions as well. So Vietnam is actually catching part from that part. But there are also downsides for as for buying from China. For example, the trade war is significantly influenced the trading relationship between the two countries. And there has been more anti-dumping and antitrust cases against China as well. So a lot of products, the high tariffs is apparently making buying from China become impossible or too expensive. And also the products in China, the price for the China products are increasing as well. That's mainly because of the increase of the labor cost. From 5 or 10 years ago, it's so easy for the Chinese factories in Guangdong or other production cities to hire highly skilled employees with, let's say, $400 US dollars a month or $500 US dollars a month. But nowadays, it's no longer possible. Even those big employers like Foxconn, they are having difficulty finding the right employees or cheaper laborers. So that makes the other Asian countries like Vietnam more attractive because their labor is much cheaper, and also which can make the entire purchasing cost cheaper as well. And another significant thing to be considered is that China is having more and more strict environmental protection laws. A lot of industries are simply no longer possible to continue existing in China. For example, we have a client doing the rubber industry in China. They supply their products to mainly all those vehicle OEMs, vehicle factories. They supply to Mercedes, they supply to GMC, they supply to Ford. And they have been having their worldwide products to be produced from China, and they bought from China for the past 20 years. But in the past few years, they own 7 factories in China in different cities. But in the past 5 years, their factories in China are being closed down by the local government one by one, and which makes them difficult to continue producing from China because the environmental pollution consideration is becoming more and more important for the local government. And they no longer want a company like that to continue producing in China, or even if they're allowing the company to continue to exist there, they are requiring them to make more capital investment to protect the environment, to dispose their emission, all the stuff, which is making the whole process more expensive. China just made a new commitment for carbon emission for the next 20 years, which very highly likely that the environmental protection measures and laws in China are going to be more strict in the next 10 to 20 years. That's also something needs to be considered for a lot of industries. If the manufacturer of your products involving pollution or some emission or kind of water treatment. And I think in the contrary, I think Chris can talk about more about the pros and the cons of doing the same thing in Vietnam as well.
Yes, thank you, Henry. Indeed, you covered a couple of the key points as well. The cost of labor is a major driver for investment in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia in particular, as you mentioned. And I'll add, though, to that, it's generally very high skilled labor, not so different than what you're finding, of course, in China. So it's not just, people use the term cheap labor, which is a sort of a pejorative. It's low cost really, and very skilled at the same time. So that's a big plus. The other big plus, you mentioned taxes. Indeed, a lot of tax breaks given by Southeast Asian nations, and particularly Vietnam. Again, they do it through a number of different types of taxes. In some cases, you have a tax holiday for a period of years, which allows that new investment to get off the ground.
Offering some kind of tax return, our local tax, entire local tax exemption for foreign investment as well.
Yeah, so the Vietnamese are just trying to keep up, I guess, maybe in some respects, with what is being offered elsewhere, including China. But then they also will subsidize the leases, they'll subsidize water and power, they'll reduce tariffs on capital goods that are brought in to set up the operation. So it's a competitive marketplace for that reason. And so it becomes attractive when you add it all up together. Admittedly, China is already offering some of these same things, but it's, your bottom line is your bottom line. So if you can do it cheaper in Vietnam, folks will come. The negative, the cons, I've mentioned already, is the bottlenecks in the infrastructure are a bit problematic and need further investment. And that's probably the biggest con. The supply chain and that sort of thing would not be as efficient as well, just internally, not necessarily just for export. Whereas China has probably the world's best supply chains and logistics, that's very tough to compete in Southeast Asia. And Vietnam is improving, but they've got a little bit ways to go. The other thing I'll mention is the environmental enforcement. You're mentioning that China now is shifting a bit on that note. Vietnam has been slower to enforce environmental regulations. There's a lot of regulations on the books, but the question is always enforcement. And as a general matter, as a foreign investor coming in, you would be less burdened, shall we say, about environmental issues. Not necessarily that's a good thing, and I'm not supporting that concept that you can come to Vietnam and just pollute like crazy and nobody cares. It's not the case. But I'm just saying that the enforcers are not at your door every week, looking for every product that might arguably be a waste product and finding you for it if it's in the wrong location.
Okay, thank you, Chris and Henry, for this very informative and also rewarding, panel discussion. And I've learned a lot. I'm pretty sure the audience has learned a lot too. And it's very interesting, to put them side by side and compare. And it make the people feel like, even deal with all the trade war and everything is going bad, we can still have a solution, and it's a wonderful solution. Okay, and I don't think we have time to answer the audience's questions, but we can definitely follow up with you. Don't be disappointed. We'll follow up with all of you and we will answer the question in emails. At the same time, some of you requested the wonderful presentation from Chris. I hope you don't mind sharing them with our audience, and we will put that along with this entire Zoom video and for everyone to review and study. Okay, and thank you again for attending our wonderful webinar. And thank you, Chris and Henry, again for giving us this wonderful presentation and panel discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Hope you guys enjoy a great weekend, and I hope to see you again in our future webinars of Yingke Law LLP. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.